Christian, any particular thing I need to mention here, text me.
Okay, will do.
Yeah, because we are
And
live on Facebook.
yes, I'm so glad all of you are here. And let me just extend a welcome to those who are joining this webinar. We're going to get started in about a minute. This webinar is brought to you by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And my name is Kristen Clark. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee. So we will get started very, very shortly. Just as a reminder to those of you who are joining us on Zoom, there is a question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. So you should feel free to submit your questions throughout the program. And finally, if you'd like to receive updates about our work at the Lawyers Committee, feel free to visit our website at www.lawyerscommittee.org. And thank you again for joining us today. Just waiting for the green light from Isabella.
Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, fantastic. Good afternoon. Welcome again. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We thank you for joining us today. We've been hosting a series of these webinars in the post-election period to provide updates to the public on where we are. And I am pleased and honored to be joined today by an exceptional lineup of panelists, including Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. Thanks for joining us, Derek. We are also joined by Vinita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Welcome, Vinita.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
And also joined by Ezra Rosenberg, my colleague who co-directs the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Welcome to Ezra.
Thanks, Kristen.
So this webinar is aimed on focusing on where we are today on November 20th, about 2.5 weeks out from the conclusion of the November 3rd general election. I want to open the conversation by providing some preliminary top level observations about where we are. First, our organization leads Election Protection, the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. And between January 1st and Election Day, we received over 225,000 calls to the 866 Our Vote hotline. We heard from voters who experienced barriers to mail ballots, voters who had trouble accessing drop boxes, voters who encountered intimidating individuals, reports of robocalls, trouble meeting notary and witness requirements, and more. We did not receive a single claim of fraud, not one. There has been no evidence of election irregularities, which are the purported purpose underlying many of the post-election lawsuits that we have been up against. Many of the lawsuits that we have seen filed by President Trump and his allies since Election Day have been meritless. We are at a period where we are dealing with meritless post-election litigation, futile recounts intended to run the clock, and intimidation pressure campaigns that are being used to wage an all-out assault on the results of the 2020 election. We are literally seeing one of the biggest post-election attempts to disenfranchise voters en masse in modern time. These post-election lawsuits are an affront to democracy. They are an attack on free and fair elections in our country. But we also see that these suits are diminishing the standing of American democracy on the world stage. The entire world is watching what is playing out here. And while the right to vote is under attack, we are also very confident that at the end of the day, democracy will prevail. The will of voters will prevail, that we will prevail in court, and that many of these suits will continue to be roundly dismissed or withdrawn. I also want to underscore the racial motivation underlying many of these lawsuits. The racial motivation is undeniable. President Trump and his allies have singled out jurisdictions with almost surgical precision that are home to large numbers of Black voters and voters of color. Thus, it's not accidental that the public conversation around these suits continues to focus on the Atlanta metropolitan area, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and other places that are again home to large numbers of voters of color. President Trump, Senator Lindsey Graham, and others also appear to be engaged in a dangerous campaign of intimidation against election officials. They are applying undue pressure on fellow Republicans to urge them to subvert the will of the people. Today, we know that Majority Leader Mike Shirkey from the Michigan Senate is meeting with President Trump. This is incredibly troubling. We know that earlier this week, there were reports that Senator Graham reached out to Georgia's Secretary of State, urging him to reject mail ballots cast by eligible voters. There were also conflicting reports about his contacts with other officials in Nevada and Arizona. We should not be seeing these kinds of pressure campaigns in our democracy today. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has partnered with the NAACP, the Georgia People's Agenda, and Black voters in a number of states where these post-election lawsuits have been filed to intervene, to stand up to protect the rights of Black voters and voters of color. I want to say a word about a federal lawsuit that was just dismissed yesterday in Georgia. That lawsuit was dismissed by a judge who is a Trump appointee, who dismissed the case on 11 different grounds, finding that plaintiffs lacked standing, that their claims were without merit, that the requested relief being sought, which was blocking certification of the election results, would harm the public interest. In an earlier state case filed in Georgia, in state court, that case interestingly focused on several counties in Georgia that are literally home to 1.5 million voters of color. That case focused on Augusta, Richmond, Chatham County, Clayton, Cobb, Fulton, Gwinnett, and Henry counties. Again, really underscoring the racial motivation underlying the post-election litigation that we are seeing. This is deeply troubling. In Michigan, which we'll talk more about, we saw earlier this week that the County Board of Canvassers deadlocked on the question of certifying the election results. But what I want to highlight here is the statement of the chair of the County Board of Canvassers. She indicated at one point during the public meeting that she would be willing to certify results in Wayne County as long as they excluded Detroit. Again, the racial motivation underlying what is happening, whether we're talking about litigation or the ministerial job of certifying election results. We are seeing all of these actions really taking on a dangerous racialized nature and form. And for us as civil rights lawyers, that is deeply troubling. In Pennsylvania, earlier this week, in a case Trump versus Bookvar, there was a hearing held on our motion to dismiss in this case. We have intervened in this case, and Again, this is a case where Mayor Giuliani has entered his appearance on behalf of the plaintiffs, and his statements both inside the courtroom and outside the courtroom during his public press conferences make clear the racial motivation underlying this lawsuit. He talked about the corruptness of voters in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. The focus on disenfranchising Black voters in particular could not be any clearer. The hearing went on for 6 hours. We have now had full briefing on our motion to dismiss, and we are very hopeful that the court will do the right thing and dismiss this baseless case. We see similar patterns in Wisconsin and Arizona. But I want to turn the floor over now to Derek Johnson. Again, we have the privilege of representing the NAACP in a number of these post-election lawsuits to talk further about the implications for the NAACP, their members, and for Black voters in those parts of the country that are the subject of these lawsuits.
Thank you, Christian. And I want to thank the Lawyers Committee for the partnership as we were positioned to respond very quickly in the midst of the chaos that was intentionally being created by this administration. Chaos that was intentional in order to distract around the fact, not only the laws, but to distract around our ability to regroup or reorganize to focus on Georgia's January 5th runoff election cycle. Which is much more important than many people may realize. The Senate, in this context, will truly be the gatekeepers to determine whether or not we can put forth a progressive agenda that reflect the needs and interests of all Americans, a progressive agenda to address the global pandemic of COVID-19 so that we can finally get a federal response to this national health emergency. There's no way to do this effectively as a nation unless the federal government step in and begin to address this global pandemic. And in that backdrop, it begins to, for me, explain why would individuals who proclaim to love this nation, to love our Constitution, seek to subvert democracy, seek to delegitimize individuals who are citizens of this nation, have been citizens of this nation, have created the democracy that we lived in. They've served in the military armed forces, whether World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Desert Storm, and they participate to ensure that their franchise, their voices are heard. But this administration, who just 4 years ago, who asked the question, what do Black folks have to lose? And right now, it is being demonstrated more than ever. It is the stripping away of a franchise that far too many of us fought for. And when you look at the target jurisdictions, the city of Detroit, Wayne County, where I grew up, a city that's 80% African Americans, a city where the voters stood up in ways in which they needed to send a resounding message that we need to be a better nation, a more inclusive nation. The city of Philadelphia and Allegheny County of Pittsburgh, where voters stood up, Black, white, and across, to say we want a more forward-looking policy framework. The counties of Milwaukee and Dane County, that's overwhelmingly represented by communities of colors, particularly African Americans, under target, and the 9 counties in Metro Atlanta. We have an opportunity to begin to build and repair our democracy so we can look forward and not look back at a time that's more reminiscent of 1950. So what we are witnessing here is a direct subverting of democracy. And because the NAACP is able to partner with the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, the Lawyers Committee, and many other groups, we must stand in unison to protect this democracy. But let us not be fooled. Just because we've seen victories in the courtroom, the fight isn't over. There will be a direct attempt to try to tamper with the Electoral College process. There will be a direct attempt to try to leverage legislative bodies not to rightfully seat electors from states that are entitled to be seated so that the Electoral College can finally put to rest the current political climate that has been germinating from the White House. We're nonpartisan, but we are political in the sense that we care about this country, we care about our democracy, and we will continue to fight to protect the rights for all citizens to cast an effective ballot. So I'm glad you pulled together this conversation so that we can continue to inform many of our constituency bases about where we are and what's going to be needed over the coming weeks as we continue to see attacks on our democracy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Derek, and for the important work that you do to, in particular, protect and safeguard the rights of Black voters across our country. I want to turn next to Vanita Gupta to talk about the situation in Michigan, which is rapidly evolving, and to also talk about the consequences of not having an orderly transition and the kind of work that we continue to see happening inside the Senate.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for your leadership, for the Lawyers Committee's amazing work this election cycle and beyond, and to Derek as well for his leadership. This has been such a heavily coordinated effort across our organizations, and really because I think we've all understood the degree to which our democracy and our communities and communities of color in particular, their voting rights are so much at stake. So, it bears repeating in this unprecedented time. When you look at the headlines in today's Washington Post and New York Times, you really have to take a moment to let them sink in when you're reading about what President Trump is trying to do. But in America, voters decide elections and politicians don't get to override their choices, no matter how they feel about the outcome. And as Kristen laid out, the Trump campaign's litigation is failing all over the country. I think as of last night, at least, it was like a 29-1 record. And the one win that the Trump campaign had was related to a very procedural win. But as they're losing these lawsuits around the country, they are now moving to a more political tactic of trying to convince state legislators to subvert the will of voters. And as Kristen and Derek both said, they are targeting jurisdictions that are predominantly Black voters, really pretty blatantly and outrageously seeking to disenfranchise the Black vote in these Black majority cities. And, right now today, you've got a small minority of Trump supporters that are trying to create excuses for state legislatures to subvert and substitute their own preferences for the will of voters. We know that today, as Kristen said, Michigan's legislative leaders, two of them will be meeting with the president at the White House later today. And I know this is creating a lot of panic in corners, but I think that's really important to recognize that the Constitution and federal law are quite clear about the role of state legislatures and state electors reflecting the will of the people. State legislatures may not directly appoint presidential electors just because they dispute or don't like the outcome of the election. Voters decide. And so there may be challenges. Everyone is expecting the Michigan State Board to certify the election on Monday. If there are any further shenanigans with regards to the state board, there will be litigation in the courts. This issue will go to the courts, but this will be an issue of first instance because never before in our history have we had this kind of antics played in an effort to subvert the will of the people. And I'm just grateful to the Lawyers Committee, to the NAACP, and to other organizations for really holding the line on all of this. We have been coordinating on the communications front, supporting in-state advocates to do the work that they need to do, and ensuring that groups with mobilization power, voting groups in these states have the support that they need to ensure that all voters are able to have their votes counted and that we have a democracy at the end of all of this. Let me just pivot because I think that Kristen has talked about what's at stake right now with the Georgia runoffs and with what the Senate is actually doing. We are seeing a holdup in the kind of lawful and orderly transfer of power, where the Biden transition team is being obstructed from key sources of information. The GSA is holding up ascertainment, a legal term of art that allows for the administration to get the resources, I think in this instance, just over $9 million to help support transition, but also access to vital national security and other information. Though they are going ahead with their planning and it isn't holding up on the Leadership Conference Coalition, reflecting the civil rights priorities and informing the shape of a Biden transition, as we do cyclically with key staff from the Lawyers Committee and the NAACP and other orgs. But right now, even this week, while Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans have failed actually to pass any COVID relief since March, the HEROES Act has been held up in the Republican Senate since May. We have seen that he continues to be single-mindedly focused on confirming judges. The lasting impact of this presidency are going to be the ways in which Trump has devastated basic tenets of our democracy. And for decades, we will see this reflected on our federal judiciary. Quick overview, the president has had 227 of his lifetime judicial nominees confirmed, nearly 90% of them white, 76% of them male. And instead of working on COVID relief and other life-saving negotiations, McConnell continues to prioritize confirming more lifetime nominees. We all saw Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation rush through in 39 days right before in the lead up to the election. Just this week, 5 more judicial nominees were confirmed, including Toby Kraus to the District of Kansas. Kraus is the Solicitor General of Kansas. He's advanced pretty egregious anti-civil rights arguments, including defending Kansas's discriminatory proof of citizenship law. We also saw Catherine Mizell to the middle, she's being sought for the Middle District of Florida. She is 33 years old. She was rated not qualified by the American Bar Association. And her record includes countless rollbacks on civil and human rights. This is an administration that has advanced some of the most egregiously anti-civil rights nominees who will serve for their lifetime, that will affect my children and our grandchildren's lifetimes. And they are moving with all swiftness to hold a hearing to replace and fill Amy Coney Barrett's seat on the 7th Circuit. This is a shameful record, and it is exactly why we need to make sure when we talk about the Georgia runoffs and we talk about this in ensuring that everyone will be able to cast their vote and have their vote counted, we understand what is at stake for civil rights with a Republican majority Senate. We are civil rights advocates. We do this work not in a nonpartisan fashion, but the makeup of the judiciary and what's been happening to our judges, all of our civil rights are at stake with our courts. And it is why it is so important for us to ensure that we have a pro-civil rights Senate in 2021 to really address and ensure that the important litigation that the Lawyers Committee and other litigating organizations do are able to have the kind of judges that will rule over this with fairness and with a respect for the rule of law and for civil rights for all people in this country. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Vanita. Thanks for your important work and for continuing to push back on the lame duck nominations of judges in particular. I want to turn to Ezra Rosenberg now to comment further on the litigation landscape. But let me just remind folks that you can go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A box. And Ezra, as you speak, I'm going to ask you to address this one question as well that has come in about the Electoral College vote. The question is, can the Electoral College vote opposite the people's vote? I know Vanita touched on this a bit, but I want to ask you to also elaborate.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. And thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel with you and Vanita and with President Johnson, and a particular honor for us to have been able to work with the NAACP in this important litigation in the post-election arena. I was thinking about what tone to strike here, because this should be a time when we're excited, when we, as Vanita was talking about transition, as we're preparing for a new administration. And unfortunately, when I talk to a lot of people, the tone and the feeling is just a certain amount of sadness that we're going through a period like this. But I'm hoping to be able to strike some points of optimism by the time I finish. The fact is that Trump and the Trump campaign and his allies and the use of their use of the courts to challenge the results would be laughable, quite frankly, because of the frivolousness of the claims. Were it not that the purpose and effect is so pernicious and so dangerous. As Vanita mentioned, there have been some 30 suits that have been filed, and every one of them, with the one exception, and that one exception just got some very minor relief, which is on appeal, is not going to change any election result. Every one of them has either been dismissed, withdrawn, or is about to be dismissed. And what they've been doing has been filing a suit, withdrawing it, filing the same suit under a different name. It's like whack-a-mole, except I think it really gives moles a bad name, because as far as I know, moles don't file frivolous lawsuits, don't dissemble, don't discriminate on the basis of race, and don't try to make existential threats against democracy. And that's precisely what the Trump campaign has been trying to do. The purpose, and this goes to one of the questions in the chat, the purpose does not appear to win in court. And there's a question in the chat that says, what do you mean by running the clock, and what would be the benefit of doing that? One of the purposes is to run the clock, and the ostensible benefit is to get beyond what's called the safe harbor date of December 8th. And that's the date by which, if the governor of a state has certified the electors to the Electoral College, that certification and that slate cannot be challenged. And that goes to is somewhat to the question that you posed, Kristen, in terms of the Electoral College. We think that there is an extraordinarily strong defense against any attempt to overrule the rights of voters, the right and effect of voters in their selection of electors to the Electoral College. If the governor, in accordance with the state law that was set prior to the election, has certified, that really cannot be changed. And ultimately, if there were some dispute between the governor's choice and a legislative choice, the governor's choice has to be upheld under the Electoral College Act. So we do not think that there's any legitimate way that delay, getting beyond the safe harbor date, going to a state legislature to select a competing slate can be successful. The other purpose of what they're doing is even more dangerous, because that's really creating doubt as to the legitimacy of the election. And that is something that I think is going to haunt us for a long period of time. Now, we've been involved in about a third of the 30 suits that have been filed. 6 of those suits were voluntarily dismissed, including a couple after our intervention on behalf of the NAACP was granted. There are still 3 that are pending, one in Georgia that Kristen talked about, one in Pennsylvania that she talked about. All of them have basically argued the same broad issues. One of their ongoing themes is that the Republican Party was not given the right to observe the count. And court after court has ruled that just wasn't so. In fact, in one of the cases in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the judge specifically asked the lawyer for the Trump administration, did you have observers in the room? And his answer was, after being forced to finally answer, he said, we had a non-zero amount of observers in the room. And the court just threw out that case. Kristen mentioned the case that Giuliani argued in Pennsylvania this past week. And she focused on the fact that Giuliani specifically talked about the corruptness of cities where there is a predominantly Black population, of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee and Detroit. The other thing that he did in that case, which was just astounding to me, he said, and this is a quote, "Absentee ballots are inherently fraudulent." Absentee ballots are inherently fraudulent. The way that more than half of the electorate chose to vote in this year of the pandemic, according to Giuliani speaking on behalf of the president's campaign, were inherently fraudulent. The good news is that by and large, our institutions have held firm. Government officials, including Republican officials like Brad Raffensperger, and who's Secretary of State of Georgia, and believe me, we are not a longtime fan of Secretary Raffensperger. We probably have sued him more times than the Trump campaign has filed suits in post-election. But he has taken the right and virtuous stand that the voice of the electorate, the votes, are going to be what holds sway here, not political machinations. Similar statements have been made by leaders of the Republican Party in Michigan. Let's hope they hold true after they meet with the president today. And in Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania majority leader said that they would not, under any circumstances, overrule the voice of the people. And interestingly, many of the judges who have thrown out the cases are judges who were appointed by Republicans, including by President Trump. As Kristen mentioned, Judge Grimberg down in Georgia, throughout the case, he was appointed by President Trump. Judge Ranjan, Pennsylvania, in the Western District, before election, throughout a case by the Republican Party. Judge Diamond in the Eastern District, appointed by a Republican president, throughout the case in the Eastern District. And Judge Brand in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, who has a case where Giuliani argued, seems to be looking at it precisely the way we would want him to look at it, which is fairly and objectively, and weighing what is really evidence and what is not evidence. So on the whole, we're extremely optimistic as to what's going to happen in litigation. Quite frankly, I'm even optimistic that were this to get to this Supreme Court, because this is not Bush versus Gore. This is not a situation where you had one state in play that had been decided by a few hundred votes. This is a situation when one candidate won the election by over 6 million votes by the time all is counted, where there are a half dozen states that make the difference, and they're not close elections in most of those states. And I do not think that this Supreme Court, or any court, with people who are looking at these issues with a modicum of objectivity, are going to want to go down in history as overruling the voice of the people, and go down as the grave diggers of our democracy.
Thanks so much, Ezra. And you answered a couple of questions that came up in the chat. I want to go next to Derek, but let me just answer. There have been a few questions about whether sanctions can be imposed against the lawyers bringing these frivolous lawsuits. And the answer is that could be pursued, but it actually would just prolong the fight, bringing in a 11B motion, for example. But in Maricopa County, Arizona, yesterday, the judge indicated that the county could seek their cost, which is a signal of the fact that the court really sees some of this litigation as baseless, as frivolous, as a waste of time and money. Derek, we have a question about the march that was held last week in DC, and concerns about kind of white supremacy, concerns about the fact that President Trump made an appearance at that march, and the combination of these factors kind of creating a very dangerous moment. Your comments?
What we witnessed on last week's march is the consistent trajectory of Mr. Trump embracing white supremacist behavior in a desperate attempt to try to have a rallying cry. What I fear most is how that grouping of individuals will continue to push their theory of white supremacy and cause harm to others. We have seen over the last 4 years the normalization of open white supremacist behavior, where before people felt they had to hide their belief systems. But unfortunately, over 72 million Americans voted for the tone that we have seen. And for civil rights groups like ours, we're going to be confronted with this reality over the next several years, unfortunately. With the federal court makeup as it is, we may not have the ability to advocate as clearly as we were able to in the past with the type of outcomes that we sought. I mean, we're talking about a federal bench that many individuals who were nominated under this administration found it difficult to say that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided. That's going to be a problem long term. So the rally last weekend is an issue, but the long-term residual effect that this administration has created, it has opened up the door for individuals to be as bold as we have seen in my lifetime, for that matter, to carry out a level of dialogue that could cause harm to any of us. So as NAACP, we are gearing up for that fight. And Christian, I don't have to say I have to transition off the call, but I do appreciate the opportunity to join you for this convening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Vanita, I want to come to you with a question next. We have a question about misinformation in the universe. And I also think that it's important when we have these conversations that we arm people with some action steps that they themselves can take to address some of the challenges that we're up against. I want to know that what happened in Wayne County Board of Canvassers, with the Wayne County Board of Canvassers, them deadlocking and then ultimately switching positions was the result of local opposition during that public Zoom meeting, where the public learned that they deadlocked and expressed strong opposition in combination with kind of strong opposition on social media. I mean, the weight of those factors, I think, is what ultimately led the County Board of Commissioners to decide that evening to change their position, despite the flip-flopping that has occurred subsequently. But Vanita, thoughts about action steps that can be taken to provide clarity to the public about what's happening and to help bring kind of closure and resolution to this protracted battle that we're up against?
Yeah, I agree with you on what ultimately persuaded the two holdouts on the Wayne County board. I think it really was they were taken aback by the wrath that they were met with for taking the steps that they did and then reversed themselves. And to the extent yesterday's news was creating concern that they were seeking to again reverse themselves, the Secretary of State said by law they cannot do that. But the public wrath and the support and organizing that had been done with Michigan voters, they were immediately able to be mobilized on that Zoom and to make their views known. And I think that's incredibly important. This is a situation where, I think that we are this is all the last ditch effort that we are seeing from President Trump as he continues to lose lawsuits around the country. He is also, I think, importantly, losing lawyers on these cases. A number of law firms that were a part of this effort have left this effort. I saw some questions in the chat asking about who's funding the Trump legal effort. The Trump campaign is funding it, and they've been fundraising on this litigation and trying to raise funds to basically pay down their debt and support these frivolous lawsuits. And I anticipate, because of the collective work that's being done and the losses they're facing in the courts, that now this pivot to Michigan, what happens with Michigan today and the certification on Monday, as I said, the Secretary of State is fully expecting the state board on Monday to certify the results in Michigan, but there will be a lot of antics over the weekend. There's going to be a press conference later today where Trump will go before the media after this meeting. And there'll be a lot of noise this weekend. But I think it's really important for all of us to keep focused on the fact that voters decided this election. Nothing that they will do, it will have zero impact on the outcome of this election, which has been decided. And so it will be on all of us to maintain clarity about the fact that voters decided this election, and that we need COVID relief. We need a government that is working, that a transition that will ensure the smooth operation. And there's been a lot of work in the lead up to this moment. Scenario planning over the last year, organizing to build out state infrastructure to help push back in the way that we saw on that Zoom call. In not only in Michigan, but in other states where some of these similar efforts are being anticipated, namely Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And so we're keeping our eye collectively, Lawyers Committee, Leadership Conference, you know, the broad swath of organizations to be vigilant about this. But I think we all know that none of this will change the result. I think the danger is, and this is the harm that we've all been focused on, is the degree to which it undermines people's faith in our democracy, people's faith in the legitimacy of the outcome. I do think it's having an impact on Trump voters. It is as part of a longer term effort that won't end after inauguration in an effort to discredit a Biden administration. And so this work, we're not going to solve overnight. I think this is the work to rebuild our democracy, to rebuild democratic norms and principles, to try to bring the country together, because all of this is further polarizing us. This is going to be the longer project for all of us, even as we see policy reforms in the states and in the federal government on things like the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, HR 1, the Omnibus for the People Act, to really address some of the gross voter suppression that we've seen this cycle. This will continue to be a very single-minded focus for the civil rights community. And so we know that our work is cut out ahead of us, but we are a community that persists. And so we will get through this.
Thank you, Vanita. And important question, what if the State Board of Canvassers deadlock on Monday? And, you know, in many respects, we're kind of heading down roads we've never traveled down before. We believe that if that is the outcome, that it may take litigation to respond to that scenario. And I'll ask Ezra to talk a little bit about how we see that playing out if there is a deadlock.
It's pretty clear that the State Board of Canvassers, it's not a discretionary act really for them to decide whether or not to certify these votes. It is a ministerial act. There is substantial case law that dates back to the 19th century, and it's consistent case law that would allow for a writ of mandamus to compel. A mandamus is a court order that compels administrative officers to take non-discretionary acts from which they must take because it's just ministerial, and this is one of those. So we are confident that there is no way that the State Board of Canvassers would be allowed not to certify these votes ultimately.
We have another question, which is, what if prominent members of the GOP go completely against statements that they've made on record in the past solely to effectuate a power grab? And what can be done about this? And this is where, in terms of action steps, I think it's important that we use our voice to really promote accountability at this moment. It's been unfortunate to see just a handful of members, a handful of Republicans in the Senate acknowledge Joe Biden as the president-elect. And I think that more pressure needs to be mounted from all of us collectively to ensure that people do the right thing, which is abide by the will of the people. There were a historic number of Americans who participated in this election, and their voices matter. And it's time that we respect the will of the people. And I think that's a message that all senators on both sides of the aisle need to be hearing right now. Let's see, we've got some other great questions here. What can be done about Lindsey Graham, and can he be held accountable for alleged interference in the Georgia election certification? And there have been calls for an investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee. And we actually joined with the Leadership Conference, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, to make a call for a full Senate inquiry. Vanita, do you want to say just a brief word on the other two committees that we've sought to activate?
Yeah, we've asked for investigations in the House and the Senate on their ethics committees because, you know, there are two different accounts of what happened, actually three, but there's what Senator Graham says happened, and then what Republican Secretary of State Raffensperger said, and then witnesses to that conversation who agree with Secretary of State Raffensperger. So there's clearly a dispute of these facts, and it, you know, Senator Graham is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who oversees the operation and oversight of important legal questions and of our election system. And so for legitimacy purposes alone, separate and apart from anything else, it seems really important that there be transparency about what actually has been transpiring. I think it's been notable that there's been too much silence on the part of too many GOP officials, but there has been every day a trickling of more and more that are coming out to support the fact that voters decided this election. Today, it was Senator Lamar Alexander, you know, in days prior, Karl Rove and the like. It feels like more and more are, you know, are beginning to speak out, but this is not a partisan issue anymore. We have never seen a politician try to subvert the will of the voters in this fashion. As we've all said, a lot of these issues are first of legal impression because our courts have never had to contend with it, or our political system hasn't. And it's important that we remember, and it's why if all of you that are watching this webinar, to the extent that you have, you know, you can make your views known about why and what's at stake for our democracy with your elected officials at every level, and calling them and urging them to speak out and make statements about this, about the importance of our democracy, of respecting the will of the voters. It seems like it may not be important, but actually we need to flood the zone with these messages and reaffirm basic principles, American principles of our democracy. We should take nothing for granted. And it's why we're all so hard at work, but all of us have power and relationships, and it really does matter.
And to that point, somebody asked, what can they do to help in Georgia? And are we still looking for legal volunteers for election protection? And we've shared the link for those who are participating, who may be interested in volunteering to support the nonpartisan election protection program. We're going to be operating on full throttle now through the middle of January, but we're actually a 365-day-a-year program. There are elections that happen each and every day. There are runoffs happening beyond the US Senate races in Georgia. So yes, we are always looking for help, and we encourage you to visit that link. And there was another question about just kind of on the ground help in Georgia. And I think that this would be a great moment to embrace one of the organizations on the ground in Georgia, a grassroots group that is fighting and working hard to reach people who are not yet registered, could use your help. And examples of organizations that you might consider supporting include the Georgia People's Agenda, Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta, the Georgia Association for Latin Elected Officials, churches and school groups. It's going to take all of us collectively really fighting to make sure that we're reaching people who are not yet registered. The other thing that you can do is share information about critical deadlines that are coming up for that Senate race. And we will share that in the chat, but the deadline for registering to vote in the upcoming Senate race is December 7th. The deadline or early in-person voting actually begins on December 14th. And people can actually take steps to request absentee ballots right now. So there's work that we can do to kind of help push those critical dates and deadlines out to the public, and just some quick ways that you can be helpful, even if you are outside of Georgia. We are past time, but we've got some great questions, so maybe we'll go 5 more minutes and then conclude. There are, Ezra, a question about what happens if the results don't get certified in Georgia.
Sorry, Kristen, I am so sorry. I have to jump in because I have to leave, but I'm again so grateful to everyone who's attended this webinar, and to you and to Ezra for your incredible leadership in this moment.
Thank you for joining us. We're officially in overtime. Thank you, Benita.
By that question, I assume they mean if the governor does not certify.
Right.
Then there's a possibility that there could be a competing slates of electors that would then maybe ultimately be decided by Congress. And if there is a deadlock, we may be in uncharted territory. But yeah, we really just do not see that happening. I think ultimately the law would side with the this slate that represents the majority winner in Georgia, which would be the Biden slate. So if there were competing slates, I think ultimately the Biden slate would win as the slate that was elected by the people.
Great. Okay, so I think we are going to stop here. We've got a few questions that we didn't get to, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. We will hold another briefing to provide a further update on where we are in the ongoing saga following the November 3rd, 2020 election. We encourage you to use your voice. We encourage you to reach out to your senators and to encourage them to do the right thing and respect the will of voters. We encourage you to help lift up critical dates and deadlines with respect to the Georgia runoff elections and other runoff elections that are happening. And if you live in one of the target states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, and there are opportunities for you to locally participate, whether that's observing the recount process in Wisconsin or participating in any public meetings or hearings. It's really critical that local people lift up their voices locally on actions being taken to subvert the will of the people. So thank you again for joining us. Feel free to visit the Lawyers Committee website to stay in touch with us and to follow our work. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.